The corridor outside room 14 of the Blessed Hope Private Clinic in Kumasi smelled of antiseptic and floor wax and the particular staleness that collects in hospital corridors at night when the visitors have gone, and only the necessary people remain. The nurses, the night watch, the occasional doctor moving between rooms with the quiet purposefulness of someone whose work does not pause for the convenience of darkness. It was 11:40 at night, and the corridor was empty except for one person. If this story is already reaching something inside you, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel and drop a like. We are pushing toward 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who joins this family is part of why these stories keep getting told. Now let us go back to the corridor and to the woman standing in it. Her name was Patience Agye-Mensah. She was 54 years old, and she had been a nurse for 31 of those years. Not the kind of nurse who counted the hours between shifts or who had arranged her career as a series of positions rather than a vocation, but the kind who had understood from her first year of training that what she was doing was not a job in the ordinary sense, but a calling in the specific sense, the kind of calling that organized a life around itself rather than fitting itself into a life that had been organized around other things. She was a compact woman, not tall, with the particular quality of stillness that certain nurses developed over decades. A stillness that was not inactivity, but its opposite. A concentrated, available presence that communicated to patients without words that someone was there, that the dark was not absolute, that the night would be attended. She wore her uniform, pale blue, pressed, the name badge on the left breast pocket that said P. Agye-Mensah, senior nurse, with the small additional pin below it that indicated 25 years of service, a pin she wore not as decoration, but as a private reminder to herself of what she had chosen and continued to choose. She had been assigned to room 14 for 3 weeks. The patient in room 14 was Madam Beatrice Owusu-Darko, who was 82 years old and who had been admitted following a cardiac episode that her cardiologist, Dr. Frimpong, described in his notes as serious but stabilized, which was the medical language for a situation that was no longer acute, but remained the kind of situation that required attention, that required the presence of someone like Patience who understood the difference between a patient who was resting and a patient who was declining, and who could tell, from the quality of a breath, or the temperature of a hand, or the particular way the pulse moved under her fingers, which of those things was happening at any given moment. Madam Beatrice was a woman who had been significant in her life outside this room. Patients knew this not from any announcement or display, but from the small evidence that accumulated around significant people even when they were in hospital beds. The quality of the flowers that arrived, the number of people who called the nurses' station to ask about her condition, the particular deference in the voices of the administrative staff when they spoke her name. She was, patients had gathered from fragments of overheard conversation and the occasional reference in the patient's own speech during her more alert moments, the matriarch of the Owusu-Darko family, a family whose name appeared on a building at the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, and on a charitable foundation that did something with education in the northern regions, and on several businesses in the city whose details patients had not investigated and did not need to know. What Patience knew about Madam Beatrice that mattered in this corridor at 11:40 at night was simpler and more important than any of that. She knew that the old woman was frightened, not of dying. Patience had spent 31 years in the company of people approaching death, and she knew the fear of death when she saw it. And that was not what she saw in Madam Beatrice's eyes in the quiet hours, but of something specific, something that lived in the present rather than the future, something that arrived with certain visitors and remained in the room after they left, settling into the old woman's face in a way that affected her. Vitals in the way that unresolved things affected the vitals of elderly patients, which was directly and measurably and not always reversibly. The something specific had a name. The name was Daniel. Daniel Owusu-Darko was Madam Beatrice's grandson, 26 years old, the son of her deceased younger son, Kwame, who had died in a road accident 8 years ago, and whose death had left Daniel in the particular position of a young man who has lost his primary protector and advocate within a family structure that has other more powerful members whose interests do not always align with his. Patience had met Daniel twice in 3 weeks. He came on Wednesdays and Saturdays, always on time, always with something for his grandmother. Fruit one week, a small bunch of flowers another. Once a cassette player because Madame Beatrice had mentioned that she missed hearing her hymns, and the clinic's television could not accommodate that. He was a quiet young man, not shy but contained, with the careful, watchful quality of someone who had learned that in certain environments it was safer to observe than to announce. He worked, patients had gathered, as a primary school teacher in Asokwa, which was not a glamorous position and was not a lucrative one, but which he spoke about in the brief exchanges they had had in the corridor outside room 14, with the undefensive simplicity of a man who did what he did because he believed in it. He loved his grandmother. This was not a performance and not a strategy. Patience had been a nurse for 31 years, and she had seen every variety of family love and family obligation and family performance, and she knew the difference between a grandchild who visited because the will had not yet been signed and a grandchild who visited because the connection was real, and Daniel Owusu Darko was the second kind, the kind whose presence made the patient's blood pressure settle and whose departures she watched from the window with an expression that was both grateful and bereft, the expression of someone receiving something they needed and knowing it would be taken away at the end of visiting hours. The something that settled into Madame Beatrice's face after certain other visitors was different. The other visitors were her elder son's children, Madame Beatrice's grandchildren from her surviving son, Mr. George Owusu Darko, who was 58 years old and who ran the family's primary business interests and who visited himself on Sundays with the composed attentiveness of a son fulfilling an obligation he understood was observed and assessed. His children, Franklin, 31, and Sylvia, 28, came separately on different days, with the particular energy of young people who had grown up with money and had arranged their personalities around its availability. They were pleasant to the nursing staff in the way that people were pleasant to service workers when they wanted something from the environment those workers controlled, which was a pleasantness that Patience had calibrated precisely after 31 years and which she received without adjustment or acknowledgement. It was Sylvia who had come that evening. She had arrived at 8, which was within visiting hours, and had sat with Madame Beatrice for 40 minutes. And Patience had checked the room at 8:20 and at 8:50, and at both times had found the visit proceeding normally, Sylvia talking, Madame Beatrice listening with the slightly effortful attention of an elderly woman managing her energy carefully. Sylvia had left at 8:55. Patience had checked the patient at 9:15 and found her vitals acceptable, but her expression carrying the thing, the specific settled weight that arrived after certain visitors and not after others. She had stayed with Madame Beatrice for 20 minutes, taking her pulse, adjusting her pillow, speaking in the low, steady way she used for patients who needed the sound of a calm human voice more than they needed the content of what the voice was saying. The old woman had fallen asleep at 9:38. Patience had noted it in the chart and gone to the nurse's station and done the documentation that the shift required, and had come back at 10:45 for the late check, and had found Madame Beatrice sleeping, and had gone to her station again, and had been returning for the 11:30 check when she heard the voices from the family consultation room at the end of the corridor. The family consultation room was used during the day for exactly what its name suggested. At 11:40 at night, it was not supposed to be in use. The door was not fully closed. The light inside was on. She could see it in the gap at the bottom of the door, a thin yellow line in the dark corridor. Patience stood outside the door of the family consultation room, and what she heard through the gap stopped her the way a physical thing stops you, the way a hand placed on your chest stops you, completely and without the possibility of continuing, as though the stopping had not happened. Franklin's voice first. She recognized it, the particular register of a young man who had grown up having his opinions treated as conclusions. The will is the problem. As it stands, Daniel gets a full share equal to ours, 1/3 each. A second voice, older, she did not immediately recognize it, but it had the smoothed, professional quality of someone who was being paid for the conversation. That can be addressed if the grounds exist. Then we create the grounds, Franklin said. A pause. The professional voice said carefully, "What grounds are you proposing?" "The old woman has jewelry in that room," Franklin said. "Good pieces. She brought 3 items when she was admitted because she refuses to leave them at the house. The nurses have documented them in the intake record." Another pause. Then Franklin said, his voice dropping slightly but not enough, not nearly enough for the gap under the door and the empty corridor and the nurse standing in it. "One piece goes missing. Daniel was here on Saturday. He is always here on Saturday. The intake record puts the jewelry in the room before Saturday. If it is missing after Saturday..." Patience Aguirre-Mensah stood in the corridor outside the family consultation room of the Blessed Hope Private Clinic at 11:43 at night, and felt something move through her that was not merely professional concern and not merely personal outrage, but was the combination of both those things with the specific clarity of a woman who had spent 31 years attending to the vulnerable and who understood, with a completeness that required no further deliberation, that what she had just heard was not a conversation she could unhear, and was not a situation she could walk past, and was not something that the morning could be allowed to arrive without addressing. Patience did not move immediately. She stood in the corridor outside the consultation room and breathed and thought, which was the sequence she had learned across 31 years of nursing. In situations that required action, the action was always better when it was preceded by breathing and thinking, even when the breathing and thinking lasted only seconds, because seconds of genuine clarity were worth more than minutes of reactive motion. The light under the door was still on. The voices had dropped below what she could hear clearly, but she could still detect their rhythm. The back and forth of 2 people continuing a conversation that had more components than what she had already heard, which meant there was more being planned than what she knew, which meant that standing in this corridor for another 2 minutes was not wasted time, but necessary time. She breathed. She thought. She thought about the jewelry. Madame Beatrice had been admitted with 3 pieces, a gold chain with a cross pendant that she wore every day, and that the intake nurse had noted as patient's personal item, not to be removed except for medical procedures, a pair of gold earrings in the small dish on the nightstand that she touched sometimes in her sleep with the unconscious reassurance of a person confirming that something precious is still present, and a ring, a wide gold band, set with a single deep red stone that she wore on her right hand, and that Dr. Frimpong had asked about once in Patience's presence, and Madame Beatrice had said, with the particular brevity of someone discussing something whose value was not primarily financial, "It was my mother's." The ring was documented in the intake record. The intake record was dated 3 weeks ago. Daniel had visited on the Saturday of the 2nd week. The ring was still on Madame Beatrice's finger. Patience had seen it 2 hours ago when she had held the old woman's hand during the 9:15 check, had felt the slight weight of it, the warmth of old gold that had been worn continuously for decades and had taken on the specific temperature of the body it lived against. The ring was still there. But what Franklin had described was not the present. It was the plan for the future, a future in which the ring would not be there and Daniel would have been present most recently before its absence, and the intake record would provide the timeline, and a young primary school teacher from Asokwa with no legal resources and no family advocate in the Owusu Darko structure would find himself accused of stealing from his dying grandmother, which would accomplish the removal of his standing in the family, and if Franklin's plan proceeded to its logical conclusion, his removal from the will that currently gave him an equal share of what Madame Beatrice had spent 82 years building. Patience thought about Daniel's face. She thought about the cassette player he had brought for his grandmother's hymns. She thought about Madame Beatrice's blood pressure settling when he walked into the room. She thought about a young man who had already lost his father and who was about to lose, if nothing intervened, the only remaining person in the family who saw him clearly. She moved, not back toward the nurse's station, not toward room 14, toward the consultation room door. She did not open it. She was not going to open it, not tonight, not in this corridor, not in this configuration. She understood enough about how these situations worked to know that confronting Franklin and whoever was with him at this moment would accomplish nothing except alerting them that they had been heard, which would cause the plan to be adjusted rather than abandoned. She moved past the door quietly and went to the nurse's station and sat down and opened the patient documentation system and navigated to Madame Beatrice's intake record and found the jewelry documentation. 3 items, described precisely, dated and timed and signed by the admitting nurse 3 weeks ago. She made a note in her own nursing log, time-stamped by the system. 11:44. Patient in room 14's personal effects, confirmed present and intact at time of late-night check. She wrote it as a clinical note, neutral and factual, the way clinical notes were written. But she wrote it with the specific intention of a woman creating a record that had a date and a time and her professional signature attached to it, and that would exist in the system regardless of what happened next. Then she went to room 14. She opened the door quietly and went in and stood for a moment in the low light of the room, listening to Madame Beatrice's breathing, the slow, slightly effortful breathing of an elderly person in a medicated sleep, each breath arriving and departing with the deliberateness of something that was working harder than it appeared. She went to the bedside. She checked the pulse, the temperature, the chart. She looked at the dish on the nightstand, the earrings present, undisturbed. She looked at the old woman's right hand where it lay on the coverlet. The ring was there. The deep red stone caught the room's low light and held it. Patience stood over Madame Beatrice's sleeping form and made a decision that she understood clearly was not a clinical decision and was not a professional decision in the narrow sense, but was a human decision of the kind that 31 years of nursing had been, in a certain light, a preparation for, the decision that a person made when they were the only person in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge, and when doing nothing was itself a choice with consequences. She was going to need help, not from within the clinic. She understood instinctively that whatever she did needed to be done outside the institutional structure, because the institutional structure could be navigated by people with resources, and Franklin Owusu-Darko was a person with resources, and a complaint made through the clinic's formal channels could be redirected or minimized or delayed in ways that an action taken outside those channels could not. She thought about who she trusted. The list, when she examined it honestly, was shorter than she would have wished. Not because she was isolated, but because the specific kind of trust she needed tonight was the kind that required not just goodwill, but wisdom. The wisdom to understand what she was about to describe, and the experience to know what to do with it. She thought of Reverend Ama Asante Boadi. The Reverend was 66 years old and had been the pastor of the Church of the Holy Spirit on Osei Bonsu Road for 22 years, and was also, which was relevant tonight, the aunt of a senior partner at one of Kumasi's most established law firms, a fact Patience knew, because the Reverend had mentioned it once in a context that was now, in this corridor at nearly midnight, more significant than it had been when she heard it. She thought about calling the Reverend at midnight. She thought about whether the Reverend would answer. She decided that a woman who had been a pastor for 22 years had answered calls at midnight before, and understood that certain calls did not respect the clock. She took out her personal phone, not the clinic phone, her own phone, the distinction mattering, and called. It rang 3 times. Patience. The Reverend's voice was alert in the way of people who slept lightly as a professional habit. Reverend, I am sorry for the hour. The hour is fine. What has happened? Patience told her. She told her standing in the corridor outside room 14 with her voice low and her back to the wall, and her eyes on the consultation room door at the far end of the corridor, which was still showing its thin line of yellow light. She told her everything she had heard and everything she had done since, and the specific situation of Daniel Owusu-Darko, which she described accurately and without embellishment, because the situation did not require embellishment. It was sufficient in its plain form to communicate everything it needed to communicate. Reverend Ama listened without interrupting. When Patience finished, the Reverend was quiet for a moment and then said in the voice she used when she had understood a situation completely and was moving from receiving to responding, "The jewelry. It is still present tonight? I checked 10 minutes ago. Everything is there. Then we have time, but not unlimited time. You said Daniel visits on Saturdays? Yes. This Saturday is 2 days away. Then we have 2 days to make sure that what is planned cannot be executed." A pause. "My niece's firm. I will call her first thing in the morning. Her name is Abina Quarti Mensah. She handles estate matters specifically. I will explain the situation and she will know what steps can be taken. Will she act on my account alone? I have no official standing in this family's affairs. You have a nursing record that is time-stamped and professionally signed, Reverend Amma said, and you have what you heard. Abina will assess whether it is sufficient. But Patience, there is something else that needs to happen before Saturday. Daniel, Patience said. Yes, the boy needs to know what is being planned. Not everything. Not in a way that frightens him or causes him to act before the legal preparation is in place. But he needs to know enough to protect himself. Patience looked at the consultation room door. The yellow line at the bottom was gone. The light was off. She heard, distantly, the sound of the stairwell door at the far end of the corridor opening and closing, which meant Franklin and whoever had been with him were leaving. She waited until the sound was fully gone. Then she said, I have Daniel's number. He left it 3 weeks ago in case there was a change in his grandmother's condition. Call him tomorrow, Reverend Amma said. In the morning, when you are off shift and you are speaking as yourself and not as the clinic's employee. Tell him carefully. Tell him only what he needs to know to come prepared. Are you watching this from Kumasi, Accra, Lagos, London, Toronto, or somewhere else in this world? Drop your location in the comments right now and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and every single one of you is the reason these stories reach the people who need them. Reverend, Patience said, what if I am wrong? What if I misheard or misunderstood? The Reverend was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the precision of a woman who had spent 22 years distinguishing between the voices that required response and the voices that did not, you have been a nurse for 31 years. You know the difference between a patient who is resting and a patient who is declining. You know it in your hands before you know it in your head. Trust your hands, Patience. They have never been wrong before. The patient stood in the corridor of the Blessed Hope Private Clinic with her phone against her ear and the quiet of the night around her and the ring on Madame Beatrice's finger, 2 meters behind the closed door of room 14. And she thought about her hands, and she trusted them. Daniel Owusu Darko was in his classroom in Asokwa at 7:45 in the morning when his phone vibrated in his shirt pocket with the particular persistence of a call that had been attempted twice already and was being attempted a third time, which communicated urgency without saying the word. He excused himself from his Standard 4 class, 23 children who were in the middle of a reading exercise and who watched him step into the corridor with the interested attention of children who understood that a teacher leaving the room mid-lesson was a departure from the ordinary and therefore worthy of note, and answered the call in the corridor outside his classroom door, where he could still see his class through the window in the door, and they could see him, which was the arrangement that responsible teachers maintained when they were briefly absent from the room. Mr. Daniel, the voice said, this is Patience Agie Mensah. I am the senior nurse assigned to your grandmother's care at Blessed Hope. He straightened immediately. In the window of the classroom door, he could see his children bent over their readers, the good compliance of children who understood that their teacher was on a call that required quiet. Is she all right? He said. His voice was controlled, but the control was doing work, the specific work of a young man who had been receiving difficult calls about the people he loved since he was 18 years old and had learned to manage the space between receiving and responding. She is stable, Patience said. Her condition has not changed overnight. This call is not about her medical situation. A pause. He heard the particular quality of a person choosing their next words carefully. Then what is it about? He said. Patience had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed it on the walk home from her night shift and in the shower and over the cup of tea she had drunk standing at her kitchen window, watching the Kumasi morning arrive over the rooftops of her neighborhood. The specific sequence, the specific amount of information, enough to prepare him without causing the kind of alarm that produced the wrong kind of action. She told him that she needed to speak with him in person. She told him it concerned a matter related to his grandmother and to his own situation within the family, and that it was important and time-sensitive. She told him she was speaking to him as a private individual and not in her official capacity, and that he should understand that distinction as he received what she was going to tell him. She told him she was not the only person involved, that a lawyer was being contacted, and that his first action, when they met, should be to agree to speak with that lawyer before doing anything else. Daniel listened to all of this with the focused, building attention of a young man whose instincts had been sharpened by 8 years of navigating a family structure in which he was the least powerful member and in which that power differential had expressed itself in ways both large and small that had taught him to listen carefully to people who spoke carefully. "When can you meet?" he said. "This afternoon," Patience said. "After your school day." "I know a place. The Asante Cultural Center Garden. It is open and quiet, and there is nothing unusual about 2 people sitting in a garden. I will be there at 4, he said. He ended the call and stood in the corridor outside his classroom for a moment, with his phone in his hand and the sound of 23 children turning the pages of their readers coming faintly through the door, and felt the particular quality of a situation arriving that you have not fully understood yet, but that you understand enough to know that what you do in the next 24 hours will matter in ways that the 24 hours after that cannot undo. He went back into his classroom. He stood at the front and looked at his children, 23 faces looking back at him with the uncomplicated, present attention of children who were simply here, simply in this room, simply waiting to be taught. And he felt, in looking at them, the specific grounding that certain kinds of work provide. The reminder that the immediate and the human were always more real than the abstract and the anticipated. Page 12, he said. Let us continue. The Asante Cultural Center Garden in the afternoon was the kind of place that existed in Kumasi in the specific way that certain public spaces existed in Ghanaian cities. Not manicured, not neglected, but inhabited. Used by people who needed a place to sit that was not inside and not commercial, where the trees were old enough to provide real shade and the benches were worn enough to feel like they belonged to everyone equally. Patience arrived first. She sat on a bench near the central fountain, which was not running, and waited with the patience her name suggested and that her profession had reinforced across 31 years. She had brought nothing. No documents, no folder, nothing that would make the meeting look like anything other than what it was permitted to look like, which was 2 people sitting in a garden. Daniel arrived at 3:55, which told Patience something about him that she had already suspected. That he was a person who arrived before the stated time because he respected the time of the person waiting for him, which was a small thing and was also not a small thing. He was taller than she had registered from their corridor exchanges, with his father's strong build that Madame Beatrice had described once in a quiet moment. Your grandfather was built like that, like a man the ground trusted, and he sat across from her on the adjacent bench with the contained, watchful quality she had noted before. He greeted her with both hands, which she noted and which confirmed what she already believed about him. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him carefully and in the sequence she had rehearsed, starting not with Friday night and the consultation room, but with the context, with her observation over 3 weeks of his grandmother's condition, with the specific effect his visits had on Madame Beatrice's vitals, with the specific different effect that certain other visits had. She built toward what she had heard rather than leading with it, because she wanted him to understand the full picture rather than receiving the most dramatic element first and processing everything else through its distortion. When she reached the consultation room, the time, the voices, the specific words, the jewelry, the plan for Saturday, his name placed at the center of it, she watched his face receive it layer by layer, the way faces received serious things when the person behind them was genuinely serious. And what she saw was not the dramatic collapse of shock, but the quieter, more complete recognition of someone receiving confirmation of something they had suspected in a general way, without knowing its specific shape. He was quiet for a long moment when she finished. The garden moved around them, a child running somewhere behind the trees, a woman crossing the far path with a basket, a pair of birds conducting their afternoon business in the branches above without reference to anything happening below. "The ring," he said. "My great-grandmother's ring. My grandmother never takes it off." "It is still there," Patience said. "I checked again this morning before I left the clinic. But if it disappears before Saturday, that is why there cannot be a before Saturday," Patience said. "That is why a lawyer needs to be involved before you visit on Saturday. Before anything is moved or removed, there needs to be a record, independent, external, professionally witnessed, of the jewelry's presence, and of the plan that has been made regarding it. Daniel looked at the fountain that was not running. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Why are you doing this? You don't know me. I am just someone who visits on Wednesdays and Saturdays." Patience looked at this young man across the worn garden bench and thought about how to answer a question that was genuine and deserved a genuine answer. She thought about 31 years of nights in corridors and hands on pulses and the specific weight of other people's vulnerability entrusted to her care. She thought about Madame Beatrice's blood pressure settling when Daniel walked into the... She thought about the cassette player and the hymns. She thought about a ring that had belonged to a great-grandmother and that was being targeted not because of its monetary value, but because of what its disappearance would... I have been a nurse for 31 years. In 31 years, I have sat with more people at the end of their lives than I can count. And I have noticed something that no medical textbook prepared me for, that the thing most people are afraid of at the end is not the dying. It is the unfinished thing, the wrong that was not corrected, the person who was not protected, the thing they should have done and did not do. She paused. Your grandmother is 82 years old, and she is lying in that room, and every time certain people visit her, she carries something afterward that affects her physically. I have watched it for 3 weeks. Whatever she is afraid of, it is connected to you and to what is being planned around you, and she cannot fix it from that bed. She looked at him directly. I can, so I am. Daniel looked at her. In his face was the expression of a young man receiving something he had not known he needed, and that was arriving from a direction he had not anticipated, which was the specific quality of genuine help. It almost always arrived from unexpected directions, because the expected directions had already been examined and found insufficient. The lawyer, he said. When can I speak with her? Tomorrow morning, Patience said. Her name is Abina Quarti Mensah. She handles estate matters, and she has been briefed on the situation. She will see you at 9. She wrote the address on a small piece of paper. She had brought one piece of paper, folded in her uniform pocket for exactly this purpose, and gave it to him. He took it with both hands. He looked at it. He looked at her. My father used to say, he said slowly, that God placed helpers in the world in the exact places where they were needed, and that the only question was whether the person who needed the help would be humble enough to receive it. Patience looked at him. Your father was a wise man, she said. He was, Daniel said. And the way he said it, simply without performance, with the quiet completeness of someone who has learned to speak of the dead without being destroyed by the speaking, told Patience everything she needed to know about the kind of person she was helping and confirmed, without any remaining uncertainty, that she had been right to be in that corridor at 11:40 at night, and right to have stayed rather than walked past, and right to have written the clinical note, and right to have called. Reverend Amma, and right to have called this young man at 7:45 in the morning while his children were reading on page 12. She had been right. And being right in this situation was not an abstraction. It was a ring still on an old woman's finger. It was a young man sitting in a garden with a piece of paper in his hand. It was Saturday, not yet arrived. Bena Quarti Mensah's law office on Prempe 2 Street in Kumasi occupied the ground floor of a building that had been a pharmacy in a previous life, and before that something else entirely, and which had accumulated across its various lives the particular quality of spaces that have been seriously used, walls that had heard things, floors that had been crossed by people with purposes, a reception area that communicated in its plain functional arrangement that the work done here was not about impressions but about outcomes. She was 41 years old, the kind of lawyer who had decided early in her career that estate and inheritance law was not the most glamorous specialty available, and had chosen it anyway because it was where the most consequential human situations arrived, the place where families revealed themselves, where love and money discovered whether they were compatible, where the wishes of the dead were either honored or violated by the living, and where, in her experience, the most vulnerable people needed the most competent help and received it least often. She had spoken with Reverend Amma at 6:30 that morning for 40 minutes, which had been enough to understand the situation in its essential shape. and she had spent the hour between that call and Daniel's arrival reviewing what she knew about estate law as it applied to the specific configuration patients had described: an elderly patient, a will with multiple beneficiaries, jewelry documented in a medical intake record, and a plan to create false evidence of theft against a specific beneficiary in order to compromise his standing before the will was executed. Daniel arrived at 8:58. He was dressed in the clothes of a man who had made an effort without having much to make the effort with. Clean trousers, a pressed shirt, good shoes that were not new. And he carried himself with the straight-backed dignity of someone who understood that how you entered a room was the first thing it knew about you. He greeted Abina with both hands and sat across from her desk and answered her questions with the direct, unhurried precision of someone who had spent the previous evening preparing for this conversation rather than being consumed by anxiety about it, which told Abina something useful about his character before the legal substance of his situation had been addressed. She asked him everything. She asked about his relationship with his grandmother, the visits, the conversations, the specific things Madame Beatrice had said to him about her wishes and her property and her family over the years of his visits. She asked about the will. Did he know its contents? Had his grandmother ever discussed it with him directly? Had any lawyer ever contacted him on her behalf? He said his grandmother had told him 2 years ago, during a visit when she had been in a reflective mood and had spoken about his father and about what she wanted the family to be after she was gone, that she intended to treat all her grandchildren equally regardless of which son they descended from. She had said it simply, as a statement of intention, and he had not asked for details because asking for details would have felt like the wrong kind of interest in what she was saying. He had simply received it as what it was, an old woman telling her grandson that he was not forgotten, which was the thing she had actually been communicating regardless of the legal specificity of the words. Abina wrote. She asked about the jewelry. He described the ring, the wide gold band, the deep red stone, the fact that it had belonged to his great-grandmother, the fact that Madame Beatrice had told him once that she intended it to go to Daniel's future wife when the time came, because Daniel's father, Kwame, had been her favorite son, and the ring was the thing she most wanted to keep in Kwame's line. This last detail landed on Abina's legal pad with the weight of something that had just become significantly more relevant than it had been 30 seconds ago. She looked up from her notes. She told you the ring was intended for you, specifically. For my future wife. Yes. She said it twice. Once 2 years ago, and once last year during a visit when she was looking at it on her hand, and I asked her about it. Were you alone when she said this? The first time, yes. The second time, Nurse Patience was in the room doing a check. She may have heard. Abina set down her pen. She looked at Daniel across the desk, with the specific expression of a lawyer who has just received a piece of information that reconfigures the architecture of the case in front of her. The ring that Franklin intended to use as the instrument of Daniel's destruction was, according to his grandmother's own stated intention, specifically designated for Daniel's line, which meant that its alleged theft by Daniel was not merely implausible on the basis of character, it was implausible on the basis of logic, because a person does not steal what they have already been told will be given to them. She picked up her pen again and wrote for 2 full minutes without speaking, and Daniel sat across from her and waited with the contained patience of a man who understood that a lawyer writing was a lawyer working, and that working lawyers should not be interrupted. When she finished, she looked at him. "I'm going to do 3 things today," she said. "First, I'm going to contact the administrator of Blessed Hope Clinic and request a formal certified copy of the jewelry intake record for Madame Beatrice Owusu-Darko's admission. This is a legitimate request on behalf of a family member, and it will be granted, and it will create an official external record of the jewelry's documented presence that exists outside the clinic's internal system and cannot be quietly amended." She wrote as she spoke, the list forming on her pad in her precise handwriting. "Second, I am going to contact the lawyer who currently holds Madame Beatrice's will. Do you know who that is?" "I do not," Daniel said. "I will find out." The will needs to be reviewed for any existing provisions that address what happens in the event of an accusation against a beneficiary prior to execution. Many properly drafted wills have such provisions. If this one does, it may provide protection regardless of what is alleged. And third? Abena looked at him steadily. Third is more delicate, she said. Third involves your grandmother directly. She is the one person in this situation whose voice matters most and whose voice has not yet been formally recorded on any of the matters we are discussing. If she has stated her intentions, to you, to nurse patients, to anyone, those statements need to be formally witnessed and documented before Saturday. Daniel was quiet for a moment. She is 82 years old and she is recovering from a cardiac episode, he said. I do not want to distress her. I understand that, Abena said. And I want you to understand that I do not propose to walk into her room with a legal pad and a list of questions. What I propose is a witnessed conversation, natural, gentle, in the presence of nurse patients who she trusts, in which she simply speaks about her wishes in the way she has spoken about them to you. The witnessing makes it legal. The conversation itself does not need to feel legal. She paused. Can you arrange for me to visit her with you on Friday, one day before the scheduled Saturday visit, one day before whatever is planned for Saturday? Daniel looked at his hands on the table. He thought about his grandmother's face when he arrived on Wednesdays and Saturdays. He thought about the ring on her finger. He thought about his father Kwame, who had been dead for 8 years and who had no voice in this room except through his son, which was perhaps exactly why his son was in this room. Yes, he said, I can arrange it. Abena nodded. She stood and extended her hand. He stood and took it. One more thing, she said. Between now and Friday, do nothing that Franklin or Sylvia or anyone in that family can point to as unusual. Visit your grandmother on Wednesday as you normally would. Bring what you normally bring. Leave when you normally leave. Give them no indication that anything has changed. And if the ring is gone when I arrive on Wednesday? Abena looked at him. Call me immediately. Before you say a word to anyone in the clinic. Before you respond to any question. My number is on that card. She handed him a card. He looked at it and put it in his shirt pocket, in the same pocket where his phone had vibrated that morning in his classroom while his children were reading on page 12, and he understood that the card and the phone call and the garden bench and the corridor at 11:40 and the woman who had stood in it were all the same thing, the specific providential chain of attention and care that had been assembled, link by link, by people who could have looked away and had chosen not to. He thanked her and left. Abena sat back down at her desk and looked at her legal pad and thought about Franklin Owusu Darko in the consultation room at 11:40 at night, with the light on and the door not fully closed, and she thought about the particular arrogance of people who made plans in rooms they believed were private, and who did not account for the possibility that someone in the corridor was a 31-year nurse who wrote things down. She thought about that arrogance, and she felt, in the thinking of it, the specific professional satisfaction of a lawyer who has been handed a case where the truth is clear and the tools are available and the person who needs protecting is worth protecting. She picked up her phone. She called the Blessed Hope Clinic administrator. She called in the careful, authoritative voice of a lawyer making a legitimate professional request, and she began, methodically and without drama, to build the structure that would still be standing on Saturday when whatever Franklin had planned arrived and found, instead of an unprotected young man and a missing ring, something else entirely. Are you watching this from Kumasi, Accra, London, New York, Toronto, or somewhere else in this world? Drop your location in the comments right now and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and your support is what keeps these stories reaching the people who need them most. Friday arrived with the particular quality of days that have been prepared for. Not dreaded exactly, not anticipated with pleasure exactly, but held in the mind with the specific attentiveness of someone who understands that what happens in the next 24 hours will determine the shape of things that come after. Patients came on shift at 7 in the morning and went directly to room 14 and checked Madame Beatrice's vitals and found them as they had been for the past 4 days. Stable, not improving dramatically, but not declining. The specific plateau of an elderly body that had survived the acute event and was now conducting the slower, more uncertain negotiation with what came next. The ring was on the old woman's finger. The earrings were in the dish. The chain with the cross pendant lay against the skin of Madame Beatrice's neck, its small gold cross rising and falling with each breath. Patience documented everything in the nursing log with the timestamp and her signature, as she had done every shift since Wednesday night, creating the daily record that Abina had asked for. A chain of professional documentation that established, with the accumulated weight of repeated clinical observation, that the jewelry was present and had been present and had been witnessed present by a senior nurse with 31 years of professional standing and no interest in the outcome of the Owusu-Darko family's inheritance arrangements beyond the protection of the patient in her care. Madame Beatrice woke at 8:15. She woke in the way she always woke, gradually, moving from sleep to presence in slow stages, her eyes opening partway and then fully, her hand going first to the cross at her neck and then to the ring on her finger, the morning inventory of a woman who had learned across many years of hospital admission to confirm that the things that mattered were still where she had left them. Patience was at the bedside. Madame Beatrice looked at her and said in the morning voice that was slightly rougher than her afternoon voice, "You are here early." "I am always here at 7, madam," Patience said. "You are usually asleep at 7. "Today I am not sleeping." The old woman looked at her with the clear, assessing eyes that had always been the most alert part of her face, regardless of what the rest of her body was doing. "Something is happening today," she said. It was not a question. Patience looked at her patient for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel is coming this afternoon. He is bringing someone he would like you to meet. A lawyer named Abina Quarti-Mensah." Madame Beatrice was very still. Then she said, "Tell me." Patience told her. She told her carefully and with the specific gentleness that 31 years had taught her to use for conversations that carried weight in hospital rooms, not softening the truth into something unrecognizable, but delivering it at the pace that an 82-year-old heart could receive it without being overwhelmed by it. She told her about the corridor and the consultation room and what she had heard. She told her about Reverend Amar and Abina Quarti-Mensah and Daniel in the garden on Thursday, and the certified copy of the intake record and the lawyer's 3-part plan. She told her all of it, watching the old woman's face receive it layer by layer, and what she saw in that face as the telling progressed was not the shock of someone encountering new information, but the confirmation of someone whose suspicions had been given their specific shape at last. When Patience finished, Madame Beatrice looked at the ring on her finger for a long time. She turned it slowly with the thumb and forefinger of her other hand, the gesture of a woman consulting something that went deeper than thought. "I knew something was wrong," she said quietly. "I felt it. Every time Sylvia came and sat with her warm face and her careful questions, I felt it afterward like a stone in my chest." She looked at Patience. "And Daniel, my Daniel, they were going to use his name." "Yes," Patience said. "They were going to use his name and his visits and the record of his presence here to make it look like his father's son was a thief," Madame Beatrice said. Her voice had acquired a quality that Patience had not heard in 3 weeks, not anger, which would have been understandable and would have been less significant, but a cold, complete clarity, the specific clarity of a woman who has been uncertain about a situation and is now, in the full light of what she has just been told, entirely certain and entirely decided. "Bring me my address book," she said. "It is in the drawer." Patience brought it. Madame Beatrice opened it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been navigating her own affairs for 82 years and found the page she wanted and looked at the number written there and said, "My own lawyer, Mr. Asante Kumi. He has held my will for 11 years." She looked at Patience. "I want him here today, before Daniel and this Abena come. I want him here at noon." "I will call him," Patience said. "No," Madame Beatrice said. Her voice was gentle but absolutely firm. "I will call him. Give me the telephone." Patience gave her the telephone and stood at the respectful distance of a nurse in a patient's room and listened to Madame Beatrice Owusu-Darko make a phone call in the voice of a woman who had not become the matriarch of a significant family by accident. A voice that was warm and precise and entirely without the fragility that certain people assumed was automatic in elderly hospital patients. A voice that said clearly and without ambiguity that she required Mr. Asante Kumi's presence at the Blessed Hope Clinic at noon, and that the matter was urgent and that she would explain when he arrived. She hung up and handed the phone back to Patience and lay back against her pillows and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at the ceiling and said, in a voice that was speaking to the ceiling and to the room, and perhaps to something beyond both. "Kwame, your son is a good boy. I should have protected him better while I had the strength to do it properly. I am doing it now." Mr. Asante Kumi arrived at 11:55, a man in his 60s with the quiet authority of a lawyer who had been keeping the secrets of significant people for long enough that the keeping had become its own kind of gravity. He spent an hour with Madame Beatrice, the door closed, patients outside in the corridor doing what she had been doing all week, being present, being patient, being the fixed point around which everything else organized itself. At 1 o'clock, he came out with his briefcase and his face arranged in the professional composure of a man who had just done work he considered important. And he looked at Patience and said simply, "She has been thorough. Whatever was intended for Saturday will find nothing to land on." Daniel arrived at 2:15 with Abena Quarti Mensa, who entered the clinic with the composed efficiency of a lawyer, arriving at a situation she had prepared for and found, to her professional satisfaction, more prepared than she had expected. She and Mr. Asante Kumi spent 30 minutes in the consultation room, the same consultation room, Patience noted, where Franklin had stood 4 nights ago in the light that was no longer on, and came out with the specific, mutually respectful manner of 2 lawyers who had reviewed the same situation from the same angle and found themselves in agreement. Daniel went in to see his grandmother alone. Patience stood at the door, and through the small window in it, she watched the old woman's face when Daniel walked in, watched the blood pressure settle in real time the way it always settled, watched Madame Beatrice reach for her grandson's hand with the reaching of someone who has been told something important and wants to confirm through touch that the person the important thing was about is real and present and whole. She watched Daniel sit beside the bed and hold his grandmother's hand, and she watched the old woman speak to him. She could not hear the words, but she could read the posture, the slow nod of the old woman's head, the way Daniel's shoulders, which had been carrying something for days, began to release the something they had been carrying. She watched for 10 minutes and then turned away and went to the nurse's station because some things were not for witnesses, because the private restoration of a person's dignity within their own family was a thing that deserved its privacy, and because her part in this had been what it needed to be, and was now complete in the way that things were complete when they had been done faithfully and fully and without remainder. On Saturday morning, Franklin Owusu Darko arrived at the Blessed Hope Clinic at 10 o'clock with a composed, purposeful manner and went to the nurse's station and asked about his grandmother and was told by the duty nurse that Madame Beatrice was resting comfortably and that her lawyer had visited the previous day and that her care team had noted an improvement in her emotional state that was positively affecting her recovery. He went to room 14. He sat with his grandmother for 30 minutes. Madame Beatrice was warm and present and spoke to him about small things, the weather, the garden at the family house, a television program she had watched the previous evening. She did not mention lawyers. She did not mention Daniel. She did not mention rings or intake records or consultation rooms. She was simply his grandmother, 82 years old, lying in her hospital bed, wearing her ring on her finger and her chain at her neck and her earrings in her ears, entirely and completely as she had always been, unchanged, undiminished, protected. Franklin left at 10:35. In the corridor, on his way to the elevator, he passed Patience Agie Mensah coming in the other direction with a medication tray. She stepped to the side to let him pass. He did not look at her. She watched him go and then continued down the corridor to room 14 and knocked and opened the door and looked at Madame Beatrice, who was looking at the window and the piece of Kumasi sky it contained. "He has gone?" Madame Beatrice said. "Yes, madam," Patience said. The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come and sit with me for a while." Patience set the medication tray on the nightstand and pulled the chair close and sat, which was not strictly the protocol for a senior nurse on a busy shift, and which she did anyway because some things were more important than protocol, and because 31 years had given her the wisdom to know the difference. They sat together in the Friday afternoon light of room 14, the old woman and the nurse, while the Kumasi sky did what it always did at this hour, moved toward the particular golden quality of a West African late afternoon, warm and unhurried and entirely indifferent to the plans of small people, proceeding with the patience of something that understood that the truth, like the light, did not require permission to arrive. It simply arrived. And if you have watched this story until this very last word, then you already know what the elders have always known, that the protector does not always come with power or with money or with a name that opens doors. Sometimes the protector comes with a nursing badge and a time-stamped log and 31 years of paying attention in corridors at midnight. Sometimes the protector is the person everyone else walks past without seeing. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that like button. We are so close to 5,000 subscribers, and every single person who subscribes is the reason these stories keep being told. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, because some stories are not just stories. Are you watching from Kumasi, Accra, Lagos, London, New York, Toronto, or somewhere else in this beautiful world? Drop your country in the comments below. Because as the elders say, God does not always send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends them in pale blue uniforms, with worn shoes and a notebook, standing in a corridor at 11:40 at night, paying attention.